All right, good evening and welcome to the Design Media Arts Department. I'm Henry Lucas, the chair of the department, and this is the opening of our lecture series 2013-2014. I have to thank a couple of people. First of all, there's cards in the front of the room and a poster made by folder design, two of our recent graduated undergrads started a company and actually gave the poster and the card as a gift to the department. So many thanks for that. There's going to be 6 lectures in total. A variety of video artists, animal charm, gaming design, Anna Entropy, media arts, Justin Menner, Lita Albuquerque, an artist, and then a more design-oriented lecture, a closing lecture by Osk Studio. But I'm proud to announce as the opener for this series, Jeffrey Deitch. He needs very little introduction, so I'm going to keep it very short. American art dealer, curator, and in 2010, he became the new director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, MoCA. This summer, though, he announced his resignation. Deitch opened Deitch Projects Gallery in Soho in New York in 1996. And it closed in 2012 when he became the director of MoCA. We have not had a discussion about what this lecture is going to be about, so I'm as curious as you are. The only funny thing I found online, or not the only one, but apparently he lives in an 8,000 square foot house in Los Feliz, which was formerly owned by Gary Grant. Is that right? All right. Having said that, here's Jeffrey Deitch.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry. And I'll just add something about the house, that it connects with something that I've done and connects with UCLA. Is one of the very talented artists who I showed at Deitch Projects is Kurt Kauper, a UCLA graduate. And one of Kurt's wonderful painting series he spent several years on are portraits of Cary Grant, I should say naked portraits of Cary Grant, and several of them show Cary Grant striding through the interior of the house, which I eventually occupied. So I love it when circles close. My first visit to Los Angeles as a professional was in 1981, where I gave a talk in similar circumstances at CalArts. And that was the beginning of my interest in the Los Angeles artists and the Los Angeles art community. And I've been coming regularly ever since. And I should say I'm very grateful to Anne-Marie Burke, the department, who asked me to give this talk and who brilliantly coordinated the installation of the architecture show that was at MoCA this summer. So the topic is open art, and it's an open topic, so please feel to ask some questions at the end. And I'm going to start with an image that you might have seen online. Most of you know what this is. Do you know what this is? Are you following Banksy's Instagram? I'm not sure you are over here. So I was in New York City on Saturday, went through the Chelsea galleries, and if you've done that recently, the galleries are strangely depopulated these days. It's not like it was 5-6 years ago where they were packed on a Saturday. Walking down 24th Street after seeing a few of the nearly empty galleries, but some good shows, I came across a crowd of about 200 people in front of this work of Banksy, and was amazing to see how it was all operating, that there'd be a few hundred people out on the street behind a rope, then about 50 would be let in. They'd rush in, take photographs like this. That's my own photograph. That's why it's not so good. And it's a painting by Banksy and by Os Gemios, in which they've sort of worked on each other's works, hanging there, surrounded by security. So Banksy has a 1-month residency in New York City, the month of October, and it's completely captured a large audience in the city. It's all over the newspapers and television, and what's so interesting for me is, let's say Banksy had gotten instead an exhibition in a prestigious gallery. He'd be waiting for reviews. Maybe a review would come, maybe it wouldn't. But instead, he created this exhibition using Instagram, YouTube, social media, and these kinds of connections. And it's a very interesting lesson to people like me who've been working in a more conventional part of art with galleries and museums for a long time, to see that somebody is sort of leapfrogging this whole system. So the elaborate structure of endorsements, critical reviews, stories in art forum, group shows, the whole process by which an artist gets endorsed and assimilated, becomes part of contemporary art history, he's avoiding and just doing it on his own. So I think that the audience is telling something to us. So I started in a very different kind of art world. I began in the early 70s, and of course this is a painting of Morris Louis and Unfurled. And when I was going to school, this was the standard. Art that defined itself, painting that was about the process of painting, where the anecdotal subject matter, theatrical presentation, all of that was excised. And it was about the artwork defining its essence. But art can never remain that pure, and I was always struck by this magazine photo of Clement Greenberg's living room on Central Park West. And I thought that was, for me, almost as interesting as the painting, because it changed the meaning. It was no longer just art, a painting about painting, but a symbol of this kind of sophisticated haute bourgeois lifestyle in New York City. And I wasn't the only one who was captivated by this photograph of Clement Greenberg's living room. Some of you know the project of Paul Sietsema. This is his model of the Clement Greenberg living room and a still from the video. And this way that painting achieves its meaning not just through what's inside the frame, but through its context, continues. And here, of course, is a Damien Hirst, which is today's symbol of the sort of haute bourgeois style, a little racier now. This is, instead of Central Park West, this is probably a beach house in Malibu. It's very interesting how the sociological, economic context shapes the meaning of art. And the talk is going to be about how the economic system, the sociological developments in fashion, other media, affect the meaning of art and are changing where art is going. So I've always been very interested in convergence periods. Surrealism, for instance, in the 1920s. This is an image of a street scene in swinging London in early, mid-60s. And I love these periods where art, fashion, music, sociological changes, film, other media all come together to create a unified statement. And I find when something is truly important in art and visual art, it's often reflected as well in music, fashion, and other fields. That's a test if something is truly resonating in society. And here's an interior of Mr. Chow's in London. It was opened in the late 60s. Gave a talk with Michael Chow at Red Cat last week. And images you probably know, Richard Hamilton's work showing the art dealer Robert Fraser and Mick Jagger getting arrested for drugs. Another version of that. And a great example of this interchange between art, rock and roll, and social issues like challenging drug laws. And this is one of my favorite pieces. This is Yoko Ono's Yes piece that John Lennon famously climbed the ladder and wrote Yes, and that was really marked the beginning of their relationship. I was lucky to do several shows with Yoko, and she's a very interesting example of going from the origins of conceptual art in the early 60s to Fluxus, one of the innovators in performance art, and then taking this outside this rarefied art world context into the biggest platform of the world. And probably the bed piece was probably the most viewed performance artwork ever at its time. Might still be. Of course, there was tremendous energy in this pop convergence in New York. And I love the way Andy Warhol used pop culture as a subject matter, but Andy became pop culture himself. Here's a great view of The Factory with Edie Sedgwick. Another view of The Factory. And I love the way Andy also connected with the most innovative rock band of the time, the Velvet Underground, and that's Andy with the Velvet Underground and Nico. This was an amazing period in the early mid-60s in New York and Los Angeles. This is Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures with the seminal underground films. And like a lot of the best of the underground films of this period, it is not just about film history, it breaks sociological barriers, depiction of subject matter that hadn't been possible in art and film before. And there's the musical soundtrack of these was amazing. Jack Smith played records, almost like a DJ, with crazy records and sounds on a phonograph as the film was going on an old school projector. And I'm always inspired by the happenings that were, of course, the first truly multimedia works in the American school. Two happenings by Alan Capro, and legendary happening by Carolee Schneemann, Meet Joy, and another view of it. So in addition to fusing the different media and creating a fusion of performance, sculpture, video, film, these works also advanced what was acceptable in terms of presentation of the body, issues of gender, sexuality. It opened up a dialogue into culture that went beyond what happened before. Another artist from slightly later time who I admired is Valley Export. I was able to show when I later opened my gallery. This is famous work, Genital Panic. And Vito Acconci was also one of my great inspirations, and was looking at Vito's work in Avalanche that really got me motivated and inspired to become an art dealer. So I figured if this is where art was going, that's where I wanted to be. And you see that what's going on here is that art and life are becoming closer and closer together. So with Vito's performance pieces, it's very hard to separate what is Vito's life, his process, and what is actually the art. And that's even goes further in the work of Marina Abramovich, who, as we now know, practices the Abramovich method. And you can even go to school to learn it. That's her with Ule. And Laurie Anderson was also very inspiring for me, the way she took this vanguard material and, like Yoko Ono, wanted to play it directly to a broader public. And so she was probably the first person to come out of the New York art vanguard art and become a popular performer, able to sell out theaters. And another aspect of this fusion, theater, video, performance arts, the Worcester Group. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see one of their performances, and they're amazing and vastly influential in theater and in other fields, where it's sculpture, performance, video, music, literature, all combined. So when I came to New York City in the mid-'70s, there were only about 5 galleries that showed progressive art. And these galleries just didn't have any open slots. So all the artists of my generation who came in, had to invent something else in order to show. And one of the things invented was Artist Space, which you've probably heard of, one of the first alternative spaces. But what was particularly interesting, which I really enjoyed and participated in, was this art rock that began at CBGB's and a few other clubs. And for me, Suicide was the most radical, and became friends with Alan and Marty, and was thrilling that I was able to show Alan's work, this sculpture of just a big pile of all kinds of discarded electronics that you just plug in and see what happens. That was a great analog to the music. And so he still is an inspiration for artists today. So if you ask Alan, are you a musician or an artist? I think he would probably say artist first, working in musical genre. And of course, Patti Smith is probably the most famous to come out of this scene, fusing poetry, literature, music, and art. And Devo, they started in Akron, Ohio, but they're really a Los Angeles band and still doing things with them. And it was thrilling to see their fresh version of performance art as pop music. And it was completely fresh and unexpected when they appeared on the stage of Max's Kansas City. The mid-'70s in New York was an extraordinary period. This was when President Gerald Ford famously declared to New York City, drop dead, that he wasn't going to help them in the fiscal crisis. And so New York was crumbling, nearly bankrupt, but the inexpensive real estate and sort of the anything goes attitude, like there are vast areas of the city the police just didn't even bother to go, it created this tremendously fertile artistic ground. And so 3 amazing musical and cultural innovations happened during that time. There was punk rock, development of hip hop in the South Bronx. This is a scene from Wild Style, this documentary that covered the fusion of hip hop, graffiti, and breakdancing by Charlie Ahern. And then the birth of disco. And this is a scene in the Paradise Garage. And some of you know that one of the reasons I was pushed out of Mocha is the release of the story that we're going to do a disco show. Well, I can't wait to do this show in New York City. And I'm fascinated with the innovations that came out of these 3 musical forms that didn't come out of the academy. They really came more out of street culture. And one of them is this elimination of the barrier between the performer and the audience. And the disco, like Paradise Garage, is the ultimate example of this immersive art form, where the dancers are almost as important as the DJ. Some would say just as important. And then there is something that you get particularly in hip-hop and in disco. It's the collage of sounds, the sampling. And this collage has become, probably more than anything else, the language of art and culture today. And all of these forms, this is Grace Jones performing at Studio 54. All of them also break barriers in terms of gender, gay liberation, tolerance between different ethnic groups, and so there, I think at its best, art is not just something that is a visual and intellectual discipline. Art also changes society, and these 3 cultural developments did. So going back to the art world, you might have heard of a seminal show in 1980 in New York, the Times Square show, and a group of artists led by John Ahern and Tom Otterness, Kiki Smith, others, put together a rambling show in an abandoned massage parlor in Times Square. And it was open till late every night. And this really marked the new art community of the 1980s. And the musical component, the performance component, the social activism component, it was all there, in addition to a renewal of strong imagery in painting and sculpture. Another institution you've probably heard of, or say an anti-institution, in New York City, the early 80s, was the Mud Club. And it was the anti-Studio 54. It wasn't glamorous, it was dark, tough, but this is where the most interesting artists could be found. That's Jean-Michel Basquiat performing with his noise band Grey. Keith Haring was also an artist who drew from all of these progressive culture developments. So disco, graffiti, hip-hop, also punk rock. So Keith's work embodied all of these influences. And there were some great galleries that also showed this new direction. Is Patty here? I know Patty was coming. She said, well, Patty was taking the bus from Hermosa Beach. It hasn't arrived yet, but that's Futura and Patty Astor. Patty lives here now in the Los Angeles area. And Patty, who was an underground film star, created the most dynamic art gallery in New York City in the early 80s, the Fun Gallery. And as the name says, it was anti-academic, and that you were allowed to have fun in the gallery, outside the gallery. The artists were allowed to have fun. And so the art could be serious, but didn't have to be deadly serious. And a lot of influential artists at the time showed there. Another space that inspired me was John Ahern's street front sculpture studio in the South Bronx. This is his famous South Bronx Hall of Fame at Fashion Moda. And this is the Fashion Moda facade. It was started by an Austrian artist, Stefan Eins, who was very excited about the hip-hop graffiti that was emerging in the South Bronx, and also wanted to do something about the terrible decay that plagued the borough at that time. And this became a very, very dynamic space. And these spaces that I mentioned, Times Square Show, Fun Gallery, Fashion Moda, were also incredibly valuable in connecting the different diverse cultural directions. So the graffiti artists, hip-hop musicians, art school type artists, people like me, all met at the Times Square Show, Fun Gallery, Fashion Moda, and the entry of hip-hop into the cultural mainstream and this whole mixing of this hybridity is due very much to these spaces and people like Basquiat and Haring, who were able to draw from these different directions in their work. This fusion of media was also happening in Los Angeles, and this is an image of a work that you all know, Paul McCarthy's Garden. I've had the privilege of showing this work a number of times. Here's a close-up of it. That's the cover of the book. And it was called, this work, Performative Sculpture. And Paul really invented a new kind of medium of using these animatronic figures and the sculpture that became more than sculpture as a whole environment. So it was a fusion of theater, sculpture, and also kind of something transgressive of pushing the boundaries of culture. And have some images also want to show of great work, Heidi House, a collaboration between Paul McCarthy and Mike Kelly that also fused the different media, sculpture, video, architecture. An artist who was doing this in a very different way was Matthew Barney, and this is an early work of his when he was still a student at Yale, where it's sculpture, performance, video, all fused into one. So I was inspired by all of this, and relatively late in my life, was already in my 40s, after working for a number of years in other aspects of art, I decided to open my own gallery where I could work with some of these ideas that inspired me and create a kind of open art and an open platform. So the gallery was called Projects because it wasn't just a place to show works of art. It was a place to invite artists to create a project, to create an intervention, and to take the art right onto the street. And I'm going to show you a series of facades of the gallery. This is Irwin Worm. It's a reversal of the usual weight loss before and after. It was connected with a special menu at the restaurant across the street where you could gain weight as fast as possible. This is part of a show where we installed art installations in 26 shops all over Soho. It's Noble and Webster, and I enjoyed looking at people sitting, the stoop across the street, and imagine that people that romances, marriage proposals occurred in front of the gallery there. It looked like that was happening. This is Super Tutor by Richard Woods, and My List of Demands by Espo, Steve Powers. Installation by the great graphic designer Stefan Sagmeister, who recently had a show at the Pacific Design Center, MoCA. And then this is something that I didn't orchestrate as a regular show. This was a community response when we had the memorial show for Dash Snow. Sacer was his tag, and some of his friends in the middle of the night did this outrageous fire extinguisher tag on the facade that was really an appropriate memorial for Dash. So the gallery, that one of the objectives was to also be a community center, to be a place where people could meet and connect. And I'm very gratified. I think that actually worked, and the Dash Snow Memorial was an example of the kind of connection with community. So I wanted a place where art was alive, where people could take it onto the street, they could connect and develop projects together through their meeting. And to give you an example of some of the kind of works that we presented. This is we showed early on, this is Jocelyn Taylor, a video walking naked down Canal Street near the gallery. It was a pretty amazing piece. Happy Smilers, a project by Jamaican artist Nari Ward. That's the inside. It's a hanging fire escape and appliances and things bound by discarded fire hose. And then a famous piece, you don't see the crowds here, of Oleg Kulik, the Ukrainian performance artist who lived as a dog in the gallery for 2 weeks. And it was a sensation, and really outraged, but also inspired a lot of people. It was a response part to this famous Joseph Beuys piece called I Like America and America Likes Me that you may have studied, and that was during the Vietnam War. And Beuys did not want to set foot on American soil, so he was picked up in an ambulance at JFK Airport, transported to the René Bloch Gallery, and spent 2 weeks in the gallery shrouded in felt with his rod with a live coyote. And so an artist in the Ukraine and Moscow, very inspired, reading about this, and this is his strange fantasy response to this. And same thing, he would not set foot on American ground. The same thing, I had to pick him up at the airport and transport him. And he was already in character when we picked him up at JFK. He took his clothes off in the bathroom. This is one of the famous shows we had where we built a skateboard bowl in the middle of the gallery. And I'm always interested in how a lot of the best art comes through these subcultures. And that's something very characteristic of art culture in Los Angeles. So much the energy has come out of skateboards community, surfers, lowriders, and see that I continue to be interested in this and how this enriches the sort of the central art vocabulary. This is a show with Steve Powers, Todd James, and Barry McGee, who became a famous show, Street Market, where we created basically a Brooklyn street in the middle of the gallery. This is an image of an opening of Barry McGee's great show, with piles of trucks, and again bringing the dynamism of the street into the gallery and the influence of it going back onto the street. This is an image of a work showed by Kehinde Wiley, who's a Los Angeles artist. I want to show this of how an example of how Kehinde is a conventional painter in some ways, but almost as important is the way he presents the painting. Notice the frame with his image at the top, and then this is part of the performance that he orchestrated on the street during the opening. And this is the great band, the steppers from Malcolm X Shabazz High School. So we tried to connect the art in different directions. I couldn't resist showing the opening of our Swoon exhibition. This is part of the interior, but what was actually more interesting is the exterior, when Swoon jumped out and crowd surfed. I don't know if you're aware of Swoon, one of the people who's reinvented street art. This is her, and she's down at the center. This is her and her crew at one of the shows we put on. And is outside where her 7 boats as sculptures were landing at our dock. And we were lucky to have a gallery on the East River with its own dock. And this is one of the most spectacular things we ever did. She had a crew of about 100 people who helped her to make these boats. They sailed down the Hudson River around Manhattan, and the project culminated in our gallery. One of the most elaborate projects that we presented at the gallery was Fisher Spooner. And you might know who they are. They're artists who wanted to create this fusion of pop music, radical performance, extreme fashion, extreme dance, and strong visual imagery. And I was very inspired by this and went all out to present the ultimate performance. And in its time, it was sort of the most interesting thing going on in this sector of New York culture. And we drew in the biggest new talents in graphic design, fashion, all these allied fields were part of this whole collective. And years later, seeing a performance of Lady Gaga and reading about her, she must have attended some of these performances. Here's Lady Gaga. And here's Fisher Spooner at our gallery. And Lady Gaga, the VMAs this year. And was able finally to meet her when she was here in Los Angeles a few months ago. And yes, in fact, she came to the gallery all the time. So I'm fascinated by the way today art serves as a generator for popular culture, but also how popular culture is looking to art and how, in the example of Lady Gaga, it's becoming increasingly fused. So for me, this is such an interesting issue because in the time of pop art, say Andy Warhol, used pop culture as subject matter and began to become part of pop culture himself. But today, it is much more direct, where you have artists like Banksy, who is going beyond the gallery system to directly work in pop culture, and someone like Lady Gaga, who is, if you listen to the lyrics of her new song Applause, Zoe played for me today, she's talking about herself as an artist. And it's the video is directed by artists who recently had a show here, Inez and Vinud. So it's so fascinating how it's becoming all intertwined. So I've said I'm very interested in this, and I love the films of Michel Gondry, and invited him to present a special project in my gallery, which was a mini movie studio. Some of you might have seen this film, Be Kind, Rewind, where the characters make their own versions of the famous films in a video rental store that all get ruined. And so we created, behind the facade, our own film studio with everything you needed. You can see a campground, there's a doctor's office, there's a police interrogation room, there was a cafe. Here are people making a film in the forest. And about 125 films were made in the gallery in New York, and it continued many places in the world. South America, it ended up in the Pompidou. So it was a fascinating example of this confusion of what goes in a gallery and what goes in a commercial theater. So we had so many people coming to the gallery with projects. I couldn't possibly accommodate them all. A lot of them were very good. So I decided to create an art parade. And so anybody who came with a good project could be in the parade. We only censored a few things that really weren't very good or appropriate. And so in our final parade, we had 1,000 participants and maybe 10 times that number of spectators. This is Kembra Fowler, the Dazzle Dancers. You may have heard of the Dazzle Dancers. What they like to do is to get invited to elegant parties, and they're like the life of the party, dancing, and everyone's having fun. And then the climactic moment, they take all their clothes off, and everybody screams. More images, the art parade. And this is a particularly good one, project of Assume Vivid Astrofocus. A Jane County balloon, maybe you know the just about the most transgressive punk rock star was Wayne County, later Jane County. So, and I was invited to come to the Museum of Contemporary Art. The mission was to bring this mix to the museum, to open up the museum to the dynamic subcultures that thrive in Los Angeles, and to take a message from this new audience we see developing that is not the same professional or academic audience of people who actually make a living in art, and to learn from them and what they're interested in and open things up. So some of you may have seen Art in the Streets. It was an amazing phenomenon with the end 8,500 people coming every day. And this is Chaz Bjorkes in the back and Keith Haring Carr in the foreground. And I should just Chaz is the great artist coming out of East LA, And he was the one who understood that the vocabulary of Cholo gang graffiti could be turned into extraordinary artistic language. So he's really the godfather of that. It's had vast influence. And the other great artist from East LA is Mr. Cartoon. This is his legendary ice cream truck. And it was amazing to see the kind of rapt crowd he drew when he gave a gallery talk. Maybe 2,000 people showed up. And he was a very inspiring guy who goes to prisons and schools in bad neighborhoods and starts his talk by saying, if I hadn't found art, I'd either be dead or be in jail. And so he studied sign painting at LA Trade Tech, and it's an amazing, inspiring story. So this is the next iteration of Street Market, that project with Espo, Rez, and Barry McGee that I showed you. This was one of the most interesting parts of Art in the Streets. An image of opening night. These are Dash Snow photographs on a background done by the Iraq crew. That was his crew. And crowds at opening night. And this is another project that comes from what I did in New York. It's with Miranda July, who some of you know, who is in LA. And she's an artist who has created an absolutely unique combination of literature, film, sculpture, performance, and if you've ever been to one of her lectures, it's this uncanny, confused structure where you're not sure what's fiction and what's reality. And I love what she does. We did a sculpture show with Miranda that, as you can see, is participatory. And that's her again. She's the best participant in her own sculptures. And then I was very interested in other Los Angeles figures like Kate and Laura Malevi of Rodarte, who are making art, but they're choosing to make it, in their case, in the context of the fashion system. And this is an exhibition of their costume designs for the film Black Swan. So the white and bloody side on the top floor and the dark side on the ground floor. So for me, they're making sculpture, but rather than showing it in a gallery, they're showing it in the fashion world. And I was also interested in going back to some of the precedents. This is a show we did of designs by Rudy Gernrich from the collection of Peggy Moffett. It was a three-way collaboration documenting the rapport between Peggy Moffett, the model and muse, her late husband, William Claxton, who was the photographer, and Rudy Gernrich's designs. And Rudy, if you look closely at some of against the pink wall, you see this day glow type green design. The images and the fabrics parallel what you saw in the paintings of Frank Stella, Jules Olitsky, Kenneth Noland at the time. He was also making art, but using the fashion system in a way that was way ahead of his time. And if you ever saw the photo of the topless bathing suit, of Peggy in the topless bathing suit, he was also invented this whole new genre of fashion as performance art. And speaking of that, this is the images of a show we did with Eddie Slimane, who right after the show became creative director of Saint Laurent. And Eddie, as you know, gets much of his inspiration from the music scene in Los Angeles. And there's a fascinating fusion of the vision that he gets out of this to create the fashion and the architecture. And it's very interesting to go and visit Eddie's stores, because the Saint Laurent stores are completely designed by him. The music is chosen by him, the fashion, so it's a completely immersive experience. He does the photography for the campaigns, the graphic design. It's also a new way of not only being a fashion designer, it's a new way of being an artist. So all of this was put together in a project that we presented for 2 weeks at the museum. It's called the AV Club. And we were very lucky. I was asked by Mercedes to help to consult with them. They wanted to launch a car, and they had $1 million available to do whatever I could come up with to create excitement around this. They wanted to present the car in the context of contemporary art and culture. So we took advantage of this, and I asked my friend Mike D from the Beastie Boys to be the curator, because I knew that he was very knowledgeable about art forms just beyond music. And we came up with this immersive show. This is Jim Drain and Ara Peterson's Pinwheels. That's with people in them. This is an amazing immersive video room by Ben Jones, who is here in Los Angeles now, and he's now the creative director for the new Fox Animation channel, working in that commercial system as well as the art system. And it doesn't really matter to him whether it's in a museum or on your TV. This is the pop-up restaurant. This is Roy Choi from A-Frame did. This is Family Bookstore, which got tremendous interest. And zines is becoming a really important art form. Santi Gold performing, and Santi Gold also, like Lady Gaga, but very different, considers herself to be an artist and doing performance art as well as music. Loves to collaborate with visual artists. And I just connected her with Wangechi Mutu. And this is an image of the crowd at one of the DJ nights. So some people look at this and are outraged and say, this is not art. This is not why we're giving donations to a museum. And maybe they're right. But I have, as you see, I've been for many years, in addition to following the developments in art, been following the developments in the audience. And we have a fascinating new audience today that is very open, that is not just professionally interested in the inside issues of visual art. They're interested in art in all its forms today, and they're interacting with it. They don't want to just stand there and look at a painting. They want to take a photograph of it and maybe go back home and curate their own show on their Instagram, Flickr account, and expand this whole experience into the social media sphere. So I thought this is a good way to end. Some of you might think this is very interesting. Some people might think it's terrible. But that's a good platform to open it up for questions.
Thanks. A microphone will be handed over by the assistants over there. I would request for the audience to speak into the microphone, because this is live streamed, and otherwise you would not be, people would not hear you. So, questions?
I just want to say, Patty, Astor, did you come in? Yes, I did. Hi, Patty. So you missed the photograph I showed of you.
I know. Anita told
Yeah. But anyway, it very glamorous. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. It was my photo, Jeffrey, by the way. I want credit.
Okay. You get credit.
Hi. That was a great talk. I had a question about, you started talking about art in the streets and the idea of like Banksy leapfrogging the system. And I'm curious about were those artists excited about showing at the museum? And now that you've come through this experience and thinking about the kind of validation that a museum has provided historically, when you think about the future of museums, do you think that there will still be this idea that they provide validation, or like will the Banksys of the world just kind of continue to want to operate outside of that system? Do you know what I mean? Like, were they excited
Yes.
to show at
You know,
the museum?
So that's a fascinating question. It's a very central question. This is Bettina. Thank you, Bettina, for asking that good question. First, there was a lot of criticism around art in the streets, and one of them is there are people who quoted John Baldessari. I don't know whether he said this or not. And they said, well, John Baldessari says street art belongs in the street and basically doesn't belong in the museum. And one of my missions was always to say that there's no such thing as a second-class form of art called street art. Like there's real art, and then there's street art that's someplace below. And the best artists who start on the street, for whatever reason, like Lee Quinones, because he grew up in the projects and just wasn't even an option of him going to a regular college. You know, he just started working on the street. That was the outlet for his talent. And so these are artists who I always took seriously. And just like any artist, they ultimately would love to have their work in a museum. And not necessarily just for the validation, it's because they want to be in this serious platform where a wider public beyond their own public can see it. But this whole issue of the validation is a very central issue right now. Okay? Because this whole, being in this system myself for 40 years, you know, I understand very well how to manipulate the system. So let's say commercial reasons, I found an artist who was at a good art school. One of my areas of expertise was to take this artist and shepherd the art through the system, introducing it to the key art critics, to the key curators, to the magazines, to the collectors, all of this, getting shows at for the regional museums and then the major metropolitan museums, and then orchestrating the whole thing through the art market, collectors, and the auction room until a successful, totally endorsed artist is created. Okay, that was my profession, knowing to do that. And so now there are a lot of people who are in that profession who know how to do it, and I think UCLA, other schools, a lot of time is devoted to discussing how to get your work through the system, how to succeed professionally. So it's kind of like a stacked deck that the people who learn how to do this, who are into this, use this museum system to get a whole group of artists who are fully endorsed and sell for big money. And because I'm so inside this and understand this, I'm more and more interested in how to beat the system, how to go around this system, because it's not the only way. And someone like Banksy, a very smart guy, and looks at this, and he doesn't want to go through all the humiliation and indignities of sending his images around and having art critics come to his studio and visit and all this. He doesn't need to do that. He figured out a way to go beyond that. And so this is a very interesting challenge for the conventional art world. And so what we're going to have are people, let's say, like maybe Lady Gaga, maybe it's too obvious, but let's say somebody who wants to be an artist and looks at Matthew Barney on one side, looks at Lady Gaga on another, looks at Bjork, and decides they're not going to go through this whole thing of sweat through 2 years at UCLA or Yale Art School and have to borrow $200,000 to do that, et cetera. And they're going to do it a different way. They're going to go right into popular culture. So the situation with the museum and the endorsement of the young artists is a very, very interesting situation now. And from someone who's been the inside of it, I tell you, it's not the only way. Bettina, do you have a response to that? Because
I guess I just, the museum is such an important, it plays a role as a repository of objects. And you're talking about artists who are selling more like intellectual property in a way, music. And so I guess it's just more thinking about, what is the future of the museum as a repository of objects, or is that role not as important in the future? And how do artists think about their sort of microeconomic systems around themselves? Because it's, there's not that many people who can support themselves like selling music, or I guess it's sort of like the economics around the artist. Like, how does that change if the museum doesn't continue to perform that role?
So sure, the museums will continue. This role is essential role in our civilization of being not just the repositories, of being the showcases for the great art of the centuries. And so that what I'm talking about doesn't change that function, or it doesn't change the function that that someone will donate to, or a museum will be able to acquire works of the great, great artists of the 1950s and 60s that, after the passage of time, are seen to be essential. I'm talking more about the artists who are active right now and this whole museum endorsement system, and this system that can be manipulated to create reputations and giant prices, and where an audience that may be interested in a broader view than this professional museum, gallery, magazine consensus. That the audience and the art is going beyond that today.
Hi. So no, stand. Neil. So I have so many questions. I don't even know how to become an art dealer, all these things. But I guess one, and split in half. It's apropos that we're in an Eli Broad building. And I'd like to really know what you learned from Mr. Broad. He's someone who doesn't see himself as an artist, but is very involved in the art world. And then two, one of the things, I'm reading Eli Broad's book right now, Unreasonable. And one of the things that he always says to people, and I'm wondering if he said it to you, what could you have done better? And I think I'd like to ask you, in retrospect, with the Mocha thing and what you've learned from Eli Broad, what would you have done better? Or what can you look back in retrospect and say, because I'm an Angelino, and I like what you did with Mocha, and I liked where it was going. So it just kind of hindsight looking back on it.
Good. Well, two good questions. Well, first, Eli Broad. And so Eli's an extraordinary person. And he is, and by certain definitions, he and Edie are the most charitable people in the entire country. And as you know, he doesn't just give his money away. He's very active in the programs that he gives the money to. It's like venture philanthropy. And whether you approve or not approve of what he did and what happened with MoCA, there would be no independent MoCA today without Eli Broad. And because nobody else stepped up when the place was dead and couldn't pay its bills. So I have to admire him for that. And I could tell, knowing him personally for many, many years, getting to know him a lot better, community is so lucky to have people like the Broads here. And it's a unfortunate, bizarre thing that it's part of the style of sort of art culture to knock people who are charitable like this and get into conspiracy theories and things like this. But there's just being in this building is a good example of how he was able to give back and continues to. And then question what I've done differently. See, I don't think that way. I don't look back. I had a great time at the museum. I love doing these shows. I could have showed you double the number of shows we did and projects. Had a fantastic time. I hope that enough people were stimulated, enjoyed. I showed some of the more fun, kind of crowd engaging things. There were also many like hardcore, very supposedly serious shows, abstract painting, things like that we did. So I had a very good time, and I don't look back. I'm very grateful to have had this experience.
Then what's next?
So to continue in this direction. And one of the things that I learned is that you don't need a museum to do big, engaging public projects. That the audience is there, that the companies, people who contributed funding for this, they'd be just as happy to do it if it wasn't an institution. So still important projects that I hope to realize.
Hi, Jeffrey. I thought your presentation was really great, and I can see that you have an extraordinary vision, and it's really sad for MoCA. And I'm wondering if you're going to continue on in Los Angeles.
Oh, yes. So I love it here, and keeping my house here. And right now, I'm working on a big project in New York. It's going to take a lot of effort, but I want to try to introduce a similar model here, and a number of people are encouraging me to do that. So for sure, I'll be doing projects here. And just to give you an example, there's an extraordinary artist here, Chris Cunningham, some of you might know, one of the innovative music video directors, but he's way beyond that. And so he's one of the fascinating people who have ended up living in Los Angeles. He moved from London. And so he's one of the people I want to develop a big project with. So the individuals, there's a version of this art music show. The disco show was more for New York, but there's another one that comes out of it that we're planning to do in Los Angeles. So yes, there'll be projects here, and this is it's you look at this audience. I mean, this is one of the great audiences for art and culture in the world. So it's very, very exciting to do things here.
Hi. So I'm part of the faculty here at our department's Design Media Arts, and we formed it partly because it's kind of interesting. You talk about pop culture and what's really happening now, and certainly our crazy immersion in technology is so much of the culture now. But for some of us who have that have been doing art using cutting edge technology, computers, that was so forbidden in the art world. And now it's just opening up a crack. I wonder why. I saw video come, photography had a struggle, but it pretty quickly moved into the art world. Video did often because the artists were all working in more traditional media. But you talked about all these multimedia pieces. Why do you think that the art world has been so reluctant to look at art that's, I can assure you, if you are saying your art is made with computers, up until very recently they wouldn't even show it. And is it just the old-fashioned idea of art that's doing that, or do you think it's changing, and what's your feeling about using new technologies in the arts?
Well, one of the most exciting things about art is that every new technology that comes along, artists are both anticipating it and they're embracing it. And it's one of the things that expands the artistic vocabulary. So my orientation is not like the museum opens this stuffy little room called the New Media Gallery. And so there's real art, and then you go into this place where there's not enough ventilation, and that's the New Media Gallery.
Yeah, we've been there.
Yeah, so I went back to this piece by Ben Jones. Okay, so this is a very good example that he is so fluent in new digital animation technologies and how to create an immersive video environment, everything, the walls, floor, it's all video projection. And so this is one of the most engaging pieces we showed at the museum in 3 years. People went crazy over this piece. So the audience loved it, and it functioned very well inside the museum. What I think needs to happen is artists like this need to challenge the conventional way of presenting this kind of work in a museum. They need big spaces. So he can't be in the media gallery. He has to be in a big room like you'd give to Richard Serra, so that you can really be immersed in it. But I think this is all going to happen. And one of the things I think is so fascinating is that certain artists are anticipating the technologies before they even happen and are helping to visualize these concepts for the people in the technology field.
But do you think the art world has been so afraid of this in a way?
Yeah,
I mean,
you see, part of the issue that I had in LA, okay, so there is this big audience that, I showed on the screen, where thousands of people really enjoying it, engaging it, and people stopping me on the street wherever I go saying, thank you for showing this, and then 3 years of the most negative possible reviews in the LA Times, the LA Weekly, and famous artists resigning off the board and things like that. Okay, so there is a kind of a conventional art world, and with its, they're all friends of mine, okay? These are people I've lived with for 40 years. This is my world too. But that became kind of mired in an academic view. And then this big audience that's pushing us into a wider direction. So that was the issue that I dealt with during the past 3 years.
Yeah, it's I always thought of art leading the culture, and you've showed some examples how the art became, was leading the culture. But with this, I guess it's always the conventional art world that, is actually way behind the times and not embracing even what popular culture is embracing.
It wasn't always the case, but
it sort of went
we have an
backwards
interesting
somehow.
situation now.
Thank you.
I think we just a few more, so yeah, maybe 2 more questions.
Hi. So I hear a lot of anti-academy in your presentation, and you present a lot of history in your presentation, and you go to MoCA and museums which preserve a lot of history, and you say that we need to change it up. Do you perhaps think that maybe if you had chosen a different venue to change things up? I mean, I understand you were invited, but don't you feel like there's a place for everybody?
Well, it's so I've devoted my life to art history, art connoisseurship. I'm as into kind of that kind of academy as anybody, and
some of your reactions, like
but
some of the way that you react.
But
it
see,
sort of leads us
what I'm
to believe
talking
that you're
about is
not.
how.
I mean,
there's
the way that you described abstract painting.
Right. Well,
You know,
there is a tendency in art, not just today, toward academicism. So one of the images I started with was the Morris Louis and Clement Greenberg's Central Park West living room. Okay, so that's an example of how someone who was the most important avant-garde critic, the first person to get out there and say Jackson Pollock is the greatest American artist, someone whose writings I've learned so much from, by 1970, he had become a crusty academic. And this kind of academicism of like kind of controlling the curators in museums all over the country with his acolytes to sort of like make sure that color field painting was what you saw when you went to the Boston Museum and the Houston Museum, et cetera, became an academy. And it had to be challenged by the conceptual artists, by artists who you know, critics like Lucy Lepard, by Rosalind Krauss, famous episode where Rosalind Krauss, who was his sort of protege and who wrote the David Smith catalog Resonée under Greenberg, then rebelled against him and challenged him about his management of David Smith's estate. So Greenberg was toppled. But so art is always about puncturing, toppling, going beyond the academy. And we have this ironic situation here where the radicals of the people, the conceptual art and heritage of conceptual art, have formed a new academy. And again, I was part of this too, and I was the assistant director of the most hardcore conceptual art gallery, the John Weber Gallery, in the 70s. It's my heritage. But it's, now it's time to break through these constraints.
So what do you say to all the academics that are here today?
Sorry?
What would you say to all the academics that are here today?
Well,
should we stop?
The best art is about perpetual revolution. Okay, and being in an academy doesn't mean you're going to be academic. Okay, and so I think you know what I'm referring to. There are many people on faculties of universities and writers who continue to be fresh and open their entire lives. And then there are others who become very doctrinaire. And in part of the dialogue around what I was doing at the museum, you saw a large group that had become doctrinaire and simply couldn't accept something like this for various reasons. One, because it was funded by Mercedes, another because the guy works at Fox TV, another, all these things that were what we did, what this artist does, is not what an artist did in 1973.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one more question.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. I wanted to get, in your words, what you think the LA art scene or LA art is compared to New York art, quote unquote.
Oh, that's also a very good question. Well, it's it's more and more fused. So, all the time, past few years, would meet somebody, introduces themselves. I'm an artist, or I just moved from New York, and that now I've spent a month or so in New York. I meet people on the street. Oh, I just moved from LA. And so I like it that there's much more dialogue between the two places. They're very different. In New York, there's so much more spontaneous meetings on the street. You can go to 6 different openings and art events easy in one evening. Here, as it's not as easy. Good luck even finding a parking space in Culver City on a Saturday night when all the openings are there. So, people need structures in LA to come together, and that's something that I'm sure is going to happen with all the dynamism here. But that's still, individuals need to make more of an effort to create platforms, meeting places in LA for artists to connect, because there's so much talent here, but that's what's lacking. The other thing that's great about the art situation in LA is, let's say, Ben Jones, Chris Cunningham, who I mentioned, they're coming here partially because all the new technologies that they want to use are available here. And an artist, Jordan Wolfson, who showed at Red Cat, was in New York. He's moved here for the season so he can work with robotics, something that didn't exist in New York City. So the technologies that you have in film and new media, artists are using here. And there's also an issue of just simple economics, and applied to New York and Berlin in the past 2 decades. It's artists need inexpensive rent, or real estate, and they need to be able to get freelance work, because the thing that really kills an artistic career is a full-time job that has nothing to do with their art. And so in LA, reasonably inexpensive real estate, particularly if you go in the outlying areas, and lots of freelance work, working for other artists, galleries, and then working in the film industry. So that's a good economic platform for a thriving art scene. Okay, so well, thank you very much, Henry.